So we're talking about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and our first subtopic will be Congressional changes under President Jefferson. Congressional changes under President Jefferson. Now, when President Jefferson took office, he asked the new Republican-controlled Congress to make some changes in the federal government. Okay? When President Jefferson took office, he asked the new Republican-controlled Congress to make some changes in the federal government. And what he's going to do is he's going to sit down with Congress and give them some recommendations on what he would like to see changed in the federal government, and then we'll see if they take his recommendations or not. So when President Jefferson took office, he asked the new Republican-controlled Congress to make some changes in the federal government. He sat down and gave some recommendations to Congress concerning changes he wanted to see in the government, and I'm going to give you 4 examples of actions taken by Congress after his recommendations, and you can make up your mind if they supported them or not. Okay, the first thing that Jefferson recommended is he wanted to see the excise tax on whiskey repealed. Remember the whiskey tax that led to the Whiskey Rebellion? It was still in effect. Jefferson did not like that tax. He asked Congress to repeal the tax, and they did. So there's number 1. So Thomas Jefferson recommends to Congress that they repeal the tax on whiskey. He didn't like the tax on whiskey, didn't think it was right, and Congress took his recommendation and repealed the tax on whiskey. The second thing that Jefferson recommended is he recommended to Congress that they suspend the Alien and Sedition Acts. Remember those that were set up for people that were not loyal to the United States when we were about to go to war with France? Okay? So he asked Congress to suspend the Alien and Sedition Acts. They took his recommendation, and Congress did suspend the Alien and Sedition Acts. And when they suspended the Alien and Sedition Acts, anyone that had been arrested and put in jail as a result of violating those acts was released from jail. Okay? So the second thing is Congress suspended the Alien and Sedition Acts, and anyone that was jailed as a result of those laws was free. So he's 2 for 2, right, in his recommendations. Another thing he recommended is that Congress cut funding to both the Army and the Navy and reduce both branches of the military in size. Jefferson asked Congress to cut funding to both the Army and the Navy and reduce both military branches in size. They also took that recommendation. So Congress did cut funding to both the Army and Navy and reduced both of those military branches in size. That will come back to haunt us prior to the War of 1812. Okay? So they're not anticipating another war with Great Britain, and it isn't going to happen as a result of what happens during Jefferson's presidency. It's going to happen as a result of Madison's presidency. Okay? The fourth thing that Jefferson recommended is that they get rid of or not renew the lease or charter for the National Bank of the United States. Remember that bank was started by who? What? Alexander Hamilton. During whose presidency? George Washington's. Jefferson did not like the Bank of the United States, and he wanted Congress to not renew the lease. Now, to explain that to you, ever since the National Bank of the United States was established, every 4 years, Congress had to re-up its lease. Congress established it in the first place, technically, and every 4 years, the bank would go to Congress and say, hey, we're doing a good job, will you renew our lease? And so far, they had done that. Well, Jefferson was trying to talk him into not renewing the lease. They did not listen to Jefferson or his recommendation, and they renewed the lease for the Bank of the United States. That will continue to be a thorn in the side of presidents until Andrew Jackson, who will finally successfully get rid of the Bank of the United States in the late 1830s. Okay? So Jefferson gets his way in 3 out of 4. The only one he doesn't is they do renew the lease for the National Bank of the United States. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which I think is very, very important. And that's President Jefferson and the Judiciary Act of 1801. President Jefferson and the Judiciary Act of 1801. Now, Tatum, do you remember by any chance? Tatum, what the Judiciary Act of 1801 did? You know, that's what everybody says, but that's the Judiciary Act of 1789. What did the Judiciary Act of 1801 do? Think about it. President Adams had this passed through the Federalist Congress before they went out of business, so to speak, because the Republicans controlled the election of 1800. What did the Judiciary Act of 1801 do? Anybody? Come on now. No, didn't remove some. Added 16. Remember, they had added 16 federal judges, and then the president got to choose those judges, and they were all Federalists. Remember? Midnight appointments that Thomas Jefferson is going to have to inherit, who's a Republican. So when I talk about President Jefferson and the Judiciary Act of 1801, remember that after the Republican victory in the election of 1800, the Republicans will control the presidency with Jefferson, and they also will control the Congress, right? So what's the only power the Federalists still have? The courts, these judges. Now, these new Federalist midnight appointments, remember that President Adams did at the last minute? They really annoyed President Jefferson immensely. And can you blame him? I mean, here, you know, Adams works hard to put as many people in office as he can from his party that a Republican president's going to have to deal with now. And so Jefferson just was annoyed by these appointments. So his goal when he took office is he was going to block these new appointments from ever taking office. He doesn't want these 16 Federalist judges that he has to deal with. So his goal is going to be to block these midnight appointments made by President Adams from ever taking office. Now, I'm going to try to explain this to you, and you might write or listen as you see fit. By law, at this time, if Zoe has been selected to be a new federal judge by the president, in order to legally assume office and be sworn in, she has to receive a commission, it's on your ID sheet, or a power of office to get the ability to be sworn in. That's how the law was. Okay? So someone, and we'll tell you who, had to give Zoe a commission or a power of office. If she doesn't get that written commission, a commission that says you have the right to be the judge, she couldn't be sworn in. Who do you think gave the commissions to these appointees? Most people think the president. Well, actually, by tradition, it was the Secretary of State, who at this time just happened to be James Madison. So it would be James Madison's job as Secretary of State to deliver these commissions to these individual judges so that they can assume office. Okay, so what? You guys are just tardy, you have no excuse?
Well, we tried to get Martinez's to call, but she wouldn't.
Excuse us.
You know, you guys are going to have to start eating closer to home. Matter of fact, I might recommend to Mr. Sanford that he have you guys eat school lunch here so you can always be on time. Well, you guys, how many would be in favor of that? Raise your hand. None of you are supporting me today? I support you. No, I don't mean you guys stay for lunch. I just mean these guys.
I don't know.
Jesus, why?
They all voted against me.
Yeah. You boys, let's see. 5, 10, 15, 17 minutes of my time was wasted.
Hey,
So
we'll
don't-
help. We shot down like
Yeah,
5
well, I'll tell you
minutes.
what, we'll see you guys after school 17 minutes today to make up for this. How's that sound? I don't mind, you know, 5 minutes late. Well, what time does school start? It might be in hard hour.
Starts 55.
So they're only wasted 11 minutes.
Yeah.
So you only have to make up 11.
I got a deal for you. Orange period. I'll spend it double the time.
You think I want to spend my
I'll give
orange
you
period
a
with you two guys? What?
Double the time. And it'll have some good
I'll
stories.
see you boys, right after class.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Anyway, moving on, don't worry about interrupting this lecture, because I was on a heck of a roll, was I not, Carter? So, in order to get to be a judge, you have to have a commission, and the person that's going to deliver that commission to you is the President's Secretary of State, James Madison. So how did Jefferson block these appointments? What did he do? What? Absolutely, he told Secretary of State James Madison not to give them their commissions. Don't deliver them. If they don't get the written commission, they can't be a federal judge, so don't give them their commissions. Now, that action is going to lead to a very, very important subtopic of a historic Supreme Court decision, Marbury versus Madison. Okay? So, President Jefferson, to keep these 16 newly appointed Federalist judges from taking office, orders Secretary of State James Madison not to deliver them their written commissions. That, my dear folks, will lead to a historic Supreme Court decision known as Marbury versus Madison. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of a hint. 2 years ago on the AP exam, the cumulative exam for this class, over 2 years as a senior, Marbury versus Madison was one of the questions on the exam. Okay, so just keep that in mind, it's pretty important. Now, one of these 16 judges that was set to receive this commission was a guy by the name of William Marbury. And he was going to be named as Justice of the Peace for the District of Columbia. So he was one of these 16 Federalists that was appointed by President Adams, one of the midnight appointments, and he was scheduled to be the Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia or in Washington, D.C. And he knew that he wasn't going to receive this commission by President Jefferson through Secretary of State James Madison. So what did he do when he found out he wasn't going to get his written commission? What did he do? He sued him, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it became a Supreme Court hearing called Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury is against who? James Madison, because he's the one that's supposed to deliver the commission. Now, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that's going to hear this and rule a decision?
John Jay.
No. After John Jay. Thomas Jefferson's cousin. Who was the second Chief Justice that was part of these midnight appointments, actually. But he took office prior to Jefferson becoming president. John Marshall. Okay? So ironically, John Marshall, who was one of these appointments, who took office prior to this, okay, he's the Supreme Court Justice. So, in 1803, the case was appealed to the United States Supreme Court and became known in American history as Marbury versus Madison. And Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the appointments, and the cousin of the President of the United States, will do the ruling on this particular decision. And he's going to rule three things in order. I'm going to tell you his ruling. So here is Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling on this case, Marbury versus Madison. First of all, number one, John Marshall rules that William Marbury has the right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, the one that set up the court system. So Justice John Marshall first rules that William Marbury indeed has the right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. So far so good for Marbury, right? However, the second part of his ruling was that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. He rules that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. So what is his third ruling then? Because it's unconstitutional, who does not get their commission? What? What? Yeah, Marbury's not going to get his commission because the act that gave him his commission is unconstitutional. So he rules first that he does get his commission according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. But then Marshall rules that the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. Therefore, Marbury does not get his commission. How confused are you? This is how Marshall justifies it. Now, this is a quote. I don't want you to write it down. You can get it off the video if you'd like, but I want you just to listen. When he was asked to justify his ruling, he said, quote, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is, what is considered constitutional or unconstitutional." This will be the first time in American history that an act of Congress, because who passed the Judiciary Act of 1789? Congress. It'll be the first time in American history that an act of Congress was ruled unconstitutional. First time ever. Now, when he ruled that it was the Judicial Department's right to decide what is constitutional or unconstitutional, Justice Marshall established a doctrine we know today as judicial review. Okay, and that's on your ID sheet. I'm going to explain to you the three things that make up judicial review. But his ruling, saying that it's the judicial branch's responsibility to decide on if something is constitutional or unconstitutional, is called judicial review. Now, you'll understand it better, I think, when I explain it to you. Now, prior to this, who had the last word on whether something was constitutional or unconstitutional? President or even Congress. Very good. This states clearly, judicial review states clearly, that the Supreme Court has the final say on what the law is. What is constitutional, what is unconstitutional. Not the President and not the Congress. The Supreme Court will decide that. Do everybody understand that? Judicial review states, number one, that the Supreme Court alone has the last word on the question of constitutionality, whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional. Not the Congress and not the President. Now, the second part, we can even tie into something that's going on today. The second part of judicial review is that the Supreme Court will exercise the power to decide whether an act of Congress or the President is allowed by the Constitution. The first part said that they will make the decision, not Congress or the President. The second part of judicial review says we will decide whether the actions of the Congress or of the President are constitutional. They'll be keeping an eye on those branches. Now, we have something going on right now at this moment that's drawing to this judicial review. Anybody know what President Trump is trying to do that is violating the 14th Amendment of our Constitution right now? Anybody been listening to this? Hispanic kids better be listening to it. Yes?
Isn't it they ask whether people are legal immigrants on the team?
Okay, here, birthright citizenship. According to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen. I'll talk about the Caballero family. Okay? Mauricio Caballero was born where? Mexico. He came here. When his parents came here, he's not a citizen of the United States because he wasn't born here. He doesn't meet the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Alexa, however, was born where? In the United States, so she's a citizen. President Trump is trying to say, from now on, if you're born in the United States, but your parents are not legal citizens of the United States, you are not legal. He thinks he's going to sign an executive order that states that. And people are saying, wait a minute, You can't do that. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the President can't override the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And if this gets into a pushing match, who's going to decide? The Supreme Court. That's right.
Did you know they already do that?
What's that?
If, like, say your father immigrated here and you were born here, but your father isn't a citizen, you're not a citizen.
That's not true. Nope. Nope, it's not. It is not true. Is it true? Am I wrong?
No, I'm
No, that's not true.
Really?
Because
No,
Alexa,
that's
how's
true.
Alexa Caballero a citizen?
Yeah, because then I wouldn't be a citizen.
She wouldn't be a citizen either. How's that true? That's not true. Right now, the 14th Amendment states that if you move to this country and you're illegal, but your children are born here, you are a citizen. That's what it states. Trump is trying to get rid of that by a stroke of the pen. Who's going to decide that if it goes to a hassle? Supreme Court. Okay, moving on. We'll discuss that later. Now, so what this states is to judicial review. 3 is that the Supreme Court can overrule actions of who? Congress and, come on, the President of the United States. Okay? So, this is really important in our country, judicial review. So, I want to make sure you understand this. Justice John Marshall basically states that it's the judicial department that'll make the law, that'll decide what's constitutional or unconstitutional. That province is called judicial review. And judicial review states that the Supreme Court will have the last word on the question of constitutionality, not the Congress or the President. The Supreme Court also states that they will exercise the power to decide whether an act of Congress or an act of the President is allowed by the Constitution. And thirdly, it basically states that the Supreme Court can overrule both the Congress and the President. We may